inspiring and rewarding.
American force posture now in Australia involves every domain: land, sea, air, cyber and space.
We created AUKUS to bolster regional and global security, to turbocharge our defence industrial bases.
What AUKUS is now about is the Americans ring-fencing the country in bases.
For all the talk about urgent strategic circumstances, for all the apocalyptic talk about war coming in 2027, the seconds on the clock are ticking down in terms of the government's language on the urgency of the circumstances we face. Yet in terms of actually acquiring a meaningful defence capability to do something about it, they're coddling old Father Time. So we are really caught on the horns of a horrific defence materiel dilemma here.
Regardless of whether you believe that conflict in our region, particularly involving China over Taiwan, is not just inevitable, but possibly even imminent, there are now big question marks over Australia's multi-billion-dollar commitment 3 years ago to the AUKUS alliance with the United States and United Kingdom. In the Senate this week, the terms of an updated treaty between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom regarding the AUKUS Defence Pact were tabled, along with a separate side understanding between the three countries. The treaty paves the way for the US and UK to transfer nuclear propulsion equipment, such as nuclear submarine engines, to Australia. But it is the separate understanding which has given AUKUS critics cause for pause.
The new terms that have been disclosed to the Senate basically make it possible for the United States or the UK to very easily walk away from the AUKUS program if they get the feeling that our program in any way interferes with their naval programs or actually for any other reason. It's disturbing for us. What it means is that for our purportedly most important submarine defence program, we are priority number 3, and the government seems content that that's the case.
Not everyone is so dubious.
So the AUKUS treaty that's been tabled in Parliament this week has a 12-month termination clause. That's not just for the US, that is for all parties. Do I think the existence of that termination clause is some degree of risk? No, that's pretty standard.
The first stage of the AUKUS submarine deal involves US manned and operated Virginia-class submarines operating out of HMAS Stirling in Perth from 2027. Australia is paying to upgrade facilities there for the massive subs. The next stage involves the US selling us between 3 and 8 Virginia-class submarines of our own, starting with the delivery of 2 second-hand subs in 2032. At first glance, it might seem inconceivable that our key ally would walk away from this agreement. But in the United States, questions are already being raised about whether it has enough submarines of its own to spare some for Australia, whether the AUKUS deal actually compromises US defence capabilities, and whether it would be better for the US to just base its own submarines in Australia.
The American president at the time, whoever that may be, has to write to Congress a year beforehand and assure Congress that the transfer of those submarines will not degrade the US's undersea capabilities, that it will be consistent with the American national interest.
The Research Service of the US Congress is offering some of the sharpest critiques of the deal's implications for the United States' own strategic interests.
The Congressional Research Service has been following this AUKUS program from commencement. They've been tracking the performance of US shipyards and monitoring what the requirements would be for the AUKUS program, and have been giving advice to US members of Congress and senators. Their advice has turned recently to offer a Plan B.
The Research Service is telling members of Congress that while US shipyards are supposed to build 2 boats a year, actual production since 2022 has been about 1.2 to 1.4 boats a year. To fulfil US requirements, and have some to sell to us, means upping the rate to 2.33 boats a year.
That's a big ask. They've been struggling to improve that rate for some time.
We do know they have significant pressure on their submarine industrial base and their shipbuilding industrial base. And everybody keeps becoming fascinated in Australia about, can the US build 2 Virginia-class submarines a year? I think we need to lift the conversation a bit above that.
The Plan B, according to the Congressional Research Service, would be for Americans to hold on to the Virginia-class subs and operate them out of Australia, instead of selling them to us. Australia would instead use the money to buy long-range anti-ship missiles, drones and long-range bombers.
So the Americans are clearly thinking about a plan B if this transfer doesn't go ahead. The problem for Canberra is that it is steadfastly refusing to consider a plan B. It's so rusted on to plan A and making plan A work that we're not considering the fallback option.
Being seen to renege on a deal with Australia, who most countries in the region view as one of the US's closest allies, which would fundamentally undermine their submarine capability for at least a decade, or if not more, would be catastrophic to US influence in the region.
Then there's the question of what happens to the money we are putting into the US submarine building program if we don't get the submarines. Would we get our money back?
So there's no clawback provision?
We are investing in the US submarine industrial base
whether we
of
get
$3
one or
billion.
not. Whether we get one or not. You cannot be serious.
The US is committed to this program.
So Australia may find itself having paid all this money into bolstering the submarine industrial production base in both the US and the UK, but we'll be left with no submarines.
Defence Minister Richard Marles was asked on Adelaide Radio today whether Australia would be compensated if the US or UK pulled out of AUKUS, as we had to compensate the French.
See, this is a treaty-level agreement. It's not a commercial arrangement. What has been tabled, it is the treaty between the three countries.
There are multiple compensation clauses in this treaty about how Australia makes payments, about having to compensate the United States. It's just there's not a single compensation clause in reverse.
A central proposition of AUKUS has always been that Australia would have its own submarine fleet, and one that was being built in Australia, when the second class of boats in the deal, a yet-to-be-designed British-based submarine, would be built in Adelaide. But autonomy and sovereignty doesn't just involve who is actually manning the submarines, and the pointy question most often comes down to what would happen in a dispute over Taiwan.
It's almost inconceivable to me that the United States would give away the crown jewel of its nuclear propulsion technology, and then Australia could simply say at the moment of military conflict or contingency in Taiwan or the South China Sea, oh sorry, but those submarines are now staying in Perth.
There's also a way in which you can read the new terms that puts a gun to Australia's head. In terms of overall sovereignty, we're putting all of our eggs into one very expensive basket.